So it'll be starting very soon.
Okay. Appreciate your help.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to help.
So, are we good to go now, or is it waiting?
Oh,
okay. All right.
I believe we're live.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Huntington. So I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge with the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Inspector General, Office of Investigations. With me today is the team for the San Francisco Field Office, which is Special Agent Mike Appio, Special Agent Bernard Durham, and Special Agent Ivan Reichard. We are all based here in San Francisco. However, our office does cover everything within Region 9, provide assistance to Region 10 when it's needed. But for the most part, these agents are the ones that are operating in your area and will be good points of contact for you in the future. I really appreciate your committee allowing us to come and present. We find this very valuable for us to be able to do this outreach. And we're hoping that we provide a good point of contact for you if you have any questions or anything comes up that might be fraud related with the programs that you're involved in. This could be a very helpful tool for you guys to keep your programs running and just preventing any loss to your tribe. I'm going to hand it off to the special agents, and they're going to provide you the briefing, but I'll be monitoring the chat, so if there are any questions, I'll answer them as we're going along, so you're not having to sit too long. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name's Mike Appio. Like Chris said, I'm one of the special agents here in San Francisco. Just a little bit of background about me before I get into the fraud awareness PowerPoint. Started my career, worked my entire career here in the San Francisco area. Started it back in 2000 with the former U.S. Customs Service. Spent 3 years with them as a uniformed inspector. Moved on to investigations with Homeland Security. I was there for 8 years doing all sorts of investigations, drug smuggling, gangs, weapons smuggling, just about anything under the sun. Moved to the OIG world with the Postal Service OIG. Spent about 10 years there, primarily working mail theft and some narcotics investigations. Both criminal and administrative, and then came over to EPA OIG this year back in April. So I'm still kind of learning the ways of EPA world. Forgive me if I'm ignorant about some of the questions, but that's why we've got Chris with his vast wealth of experience on to guide us as we go along. So with that being said, let me jump right into the fraud awareness briefing here, and hopefully I can do it without too many problems. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see it. If for some reason it's not showing up, Bernard, if you or Ivan could just let me know. We'll try to work through the technical difficulties. Okay, so we're going to give an overview of the OIG at large and then the Office of Investigations, which is the component that myself, Bernard, Ivan, and Chris work in. Potential fraud indicators, case examples, what we can do to mitigate fraud risks, and then mandatory disclosures. Okay, so the organizational structure of the OIG, we are headed by an inspector general. Underneath that, we've got the deputy and the associate deputy inspector general, and then the various offices underneath: audit, special review and evaluation, management, and then our Office of Investigations, which is what we're going to concentrate on today. We derive our authority to conduct our investigations and audits from the Inspector General Act of 1978, which allows the inspectors general of various agencies to conduct audits and investigations relating to fraud, waste, and abuse. In particular for us, We're looking at programs and operations of the EPA and also the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. We are a independent office from big EPA, so we have our own chain of command, and that's necessary so that we can conduct impartial investigations without undue influence. Our job is to promote economy and efficiency and detect and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. So we've got various means to access EPA records and information. As just mentioned, the Inspector General Act of 1978, the EPA Manual 6500, Chapter 3, Functions and Activities of the Office of Inspector General, the Code of Federal Regulations, 5 CFR, Part 2635, Standards of Ethical Conduct, and a message from Administrator Michael Regan in April of this year, reminding employees that cooperating with the OIG, EPA employees, that cooperating with the OIG is in the best interest of the public, and it provides an opportunity to improve performance and efficiency across the agency. And it's, in addition to that, it's incumbent upon all EPA employees to report possible waste, fraud, and abuse to the OIG, including theft, misuse of contract or grant funds, misuse of EPA equipment or assets for personal gain, falsification of reports or records, or serious employee misconduct. Now on to the Office of Investigations, where the four of us work. We are the law enforcement arm of the Office of Inspector General. And we prioritize our investigations. Under this new administration, we are looking very strongly at contract and grant fraud. I know in previous years, they were looking more at employee misconduct, but we are trying to be, at least in the current climate, make sure we're being good custodians of the funds that EPA is dealing out. There is another law enforcement arm of the EPA, the EPA Criminal Investigation Division. That is a separate agency from us, and the delineation between the two is CID investigates crimes against the environment, while the Office of Investigations for OIG investigates crimes and other violations against the EPA itself. Our top priorities include significant fraud, as I mentioned, program integrity, criminal wrongdoing, allegations of serious employee misconduct and or dishonesty. And there's a big push right now to deal with computer intrusion and cybercrime investigations. And we've got a unit at headquarters specifically dedicated to that. EPA OIG special agents have statutory law enforcement authority to conduct criminal investigations. We are fully trained and empowered criminal investigators as any other agency would have. And we've got offices in all of the EPA regions. As Chris mentioned, the four of us are based in San Francisco, and we cover, between Bernard, Ivan, and myself, we cover all these states in Region 9. We've also got 3 agents up in Region 10 in Seattle covering that area, and we work pretty closely with those guys up there. The investigative process, we get a complaint, whether it's through our hotline, whether it's through a contact that we make during presentation like this or other fraud presentations that we give, whether it's somebody from EPA giving us a call thinking that they might have seen or heard something that they think needs to be looked at. However, we get the information, once the complaint comes in, it's assigned to an agent. We begin our inquiries, which we'll go into in another slide. And then once we complete the investigation, we gather our evidence and our facts and put our reports together. We will present it to the appropriate entity for action. That may mean going to the U.S. Attorney's Office for a criminal prosecution. That may mean going to the U.S. Attorney's Office for a civil prosecution. It could mean suspension or debarment. In the case of employee investigations, it could mean administrative process where we turn over the reports to management for some sort of disciplinary action. So we've got various means to wrap up a complaint once we finish the investigation, depending on the level of culpability, the amount of evidence that we have, and sort of the outcome that can be had from that. Excuse me. So we've got various tools to help us along the road from complaint to completed investigation. The False Claims Act, the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act, suspension and debarment, as I mentioned, mandatory disclosures, referrals to the agency for additional actions, as I mentioned, in cases of employee misconduct investigations. And to gather evidence, we've got lots of tools at our disposal. An IG subpoena, which is an administrative subpoena that's issued through our agency, signed by our Inspector General. Grand jury subpoena, which is issued under the authority of the grand jury sitting in whatever judicial district we're working that case out of. Search warrant, request for records, civil investigative demand. We might get records from witnesses. We might get records, from a business. We've got various, let me go back there for a second. Various means at our disposal to get records, but then we also employ typical investigative means. Surveillance, we do tons of interviews. Bernard, Ivan, and myself are always traveling throughout Region 9 to the various states, doing interviews in person, because that's a staple of a criminal investigator bag of tricks to gather information. We might do trash runs, consensually monitored phone calls if we've got a cooperating witness or an informant. Anything that you've probably seen in a movie or on TV that special agents do to collect information and evidence, we do that. We have those means at our disposal, and we've all got backgrounds in other agencies where we've done these different techniques time and again. So we've got actual real world experience in doing them. We'll do undercover operations, undercover meetings, any means that we can collect the information that we need in a lawful manner so that it can be used in a criminal, civil, or administrative proceeding. We will use that in an attempt to flesh out the complaint and make a determination of if there was wrongdoing, or conversely, if there was no wrongdoing. And if there's a complaint that comes in and we investigate it and it shows that there was no wrongdoing, there's no malfeasance, there's no criminal responsibility, that's just as important for us to find that out as it is to find out if somebody is doing something wrong. So we're not just out to get people. Our mission is to collect the facts, and let the facts speak for themselves. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ivan, who is going to go through potential fraud indicators and talk to you about some of the things that you can keep an eye out for. And if you see these, report it to us. That'll be that initial complaint intake, starting the process of us jacketing an investigation and seeing where this leads us to. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Ivan.
Okay, so potential fraud indicators. You could go to the next slide. Common fraud schemes. There's bribery, kickbacks, labor mischarging, cost mischarging, conspiracy, product substitution, conflict of interest, embezzlement, and misuse of money. Each of these violations of law are subject to criminal prosecution, fines, restitution, and civil penalties. You could go over to the next slide. So, lack of separation of duties, undisclosed personal and organizational conflicts of interest, inadequate internal controls, management override of key internal controls, failure to account for transactions, connected related vendors or similar vendors, different records from multiple sources, inaccurate or questionable invoices, unapproved substitution of products, and subawards to conflicted or related parties and entities. These are all fraud indicators that you should be looking out for. You could go on to the next slide. Unexplained entries of altered records, inadequate or missing documentation, unauthorized transactions, offers of gifts, money, or other gratuities from contractors, grantees, or other individuals dealing with the government, photocopies of documents where it is difficult to detect alteration, false or misleading information, missing approval signatures, charging personal expenses as business expenses against the grant, and charging for costs which have not been incurred or are not attributable to a grant. These are all fraud indicators. Charging for inflated labor costs or hours, or categories of labor which have not been incurred, for example, fictitious employees, contractors, or consultants. Falsifying information in grant applications or contract proposals. Billing more than one grant or contract for the same work. Falsifying test results or other data. Substituting approved materials with unauthorized products. Misrepresenting a project's status to continue receiving government funds. Charging higher rates than those stated or negotiated for in the bid or contract. Influencing government employees to award a contract to a particular company, family member, or friend. So let me pull this slide in my screen because I can't really read that one. So what is wrong? Environmental supply company. You can't really see in this slide, but you could see that they have misled in the invoice and the amounts. We'll just move on to the next slide because you can't really read it. So here we have a business and vendor list with different customers and billing addresses, which might be misrepresented for a grant or award. So if you could go to the next slide. So program integrity. Maintaining integrity in government programs is important to maintain trust and in some cases ensure public safety. The EPA administers and provides oversight for many programs. In many instances, the programs are delegated to the states, third parties to administer. Often, there is no direct funding provided to a program participant. EPA programs examples include Renewable Fuel Standard Program, Renewable Identification Number, Energy Star, Diesel Emissions Reduction Act or DERA, product labeling, and state response programs. Each year, the EPA awards over $4 billion in funding for grants and federal assistance agreements to state governments, local governments, universities, nonprofit organizations, and individuals. These grants support national infrastructure programs for the environment and human health, and environmental justice programs. They fund scientific research, studies, and analysis, further science to protect human health and the environment. And all these are susceptible to fraud and waste and abuse. So types of EPA contracts. Superfund and other areas. Superfund Environmental Services Assistance Team, ESAT. Superfund Technical Assessment and Response Team, START or START. Emergency Rapid Response Services, ERRS. And Contract Laboratory Program, CLP. So contract recipients are large businesses, small and disadvantaged businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, historically underutilized business owners, and Business Development Program, AA. So the Small Business Innovation Research Program, known as SBIR, is where recipients are stewards of federal funds. The EPA is one of 12 entities that participate in the SBIR program. Next slide. Laboratory fraud. The definition is the deliberate falsification of analytical and quality assurance results, where failed method and contractual requirements are made to appear acceptable. Best practices for the detection and deterrence laboratory fraud is where this came out from, March 1997. Next slide. So research misconduct, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism in stages of research, significant departure, intentional, and knowledgeable or reckless. So the fraud indicators for the lab fraud, research protocols or standards not being followed, internal or external. EPA, contractor using outside lab. Downplaying the proper use of protocols or standards. Data manipulation, such as downplaying or exaggerating source, quality assurance, quality control samples. Different handwriting or data gathering sheets. Lack of supporting documentation or change in supporting documentation, storage or management of reports, samples, supporting documentation, evidence, and other such material. And now my colleague Bernard Durham is going to jump in.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bernard Durham. Like Chris said, I'm a special agent with EPA OIG here in San Francisco. And I'm going to talk about serious employee misconduct. This probably won't really touch in your guys' domain. However, if there is something you see, we have hotlines and you can contact any of us. Sort of this is your point of contact if you sort of sense that an EPA employee that you're working with is not doing what they should have been. So basically, employee misconduct is one of the major sort of tenets in our investigative capacity because we are trying to stop waste, fraud, and abuse, and maintaining the integrity and public trust in the EPA workforce is one way we do that. So we usually get involved if there's some type of criminal malfeasance. However, we'll also deal with sort of administrative fraud. So again, this might not really concern your work dealing with sort of the tribes, but CARES Act fraud, we're seeing a lot of that stuff, especially after the COVID pandemic. Time and attendance violations, purchase or travel card fraud, and then theft or conversion of government property. Something that you might deal with would be bribes and kickbacks. So if any type of EPA employee is saying like, hey, I might get you a little bit more money, or I might get you a little bit more favorable outcome if you do X, Y, and Z, that would be a sort of an example of kickback or bribery, and that's something we would definitely be involved. This news release down here, this is actually a famous case from a couple of years ago. It involved a very, very, very high EPA employee who basically was claiming that he worked for the CIA as sort of a, side gig, and he would be away from the agency still getting paid while he was on his quote unquote CIA duties. So he ended up pleading guilty and had to pay back over $800,000 in restitution, and then he forfeited additional money to the DOJ. Next slide. So here's some case examples. So again, here a lot of our cases involve program management. As you all know, the EPA gives a lot of money to local, state, tribal entities. Also the SBIR, which is what Ivan sort of touched based on. So we're doling out a lot of funds, and I think a lot of what Ivan was saying with the fraud indicators, lack of controls and separation of duties, and that's something when you are doing your grant writing or when you are setting up sort of your apparatus to manage EPA funds, establishing those firm controls, those firm separation of duties, sort of basic accounting 101, basic auditing 101. These are definitely good ways to help you sort of have a seamless relationship with EPA and be able to put those funds to good use for what they were intended for. All right, next slide. I don't know what that is really, so we'll just go to the next slide. So I think this is just kind of using some of the investigative techniques that we do. So both undercover. So I
can jump in here real quick for you, Bernard. So these are photos taken.
I think Chris froze.
All right. Yeah. I froze up. These are photos taken from the case agents that work the actual case. So these are actual photos from the investigation, where the folks for that previous slide on the school bus retrofit project, just showing you that our agents do have a very hard life in some of the places that they do have to travel to, such as the U.S. Virgin Islands, to conduct surveillance on folks that are claiming that they're in hardship or whatnot. So it's just showing you that we are going to track down and help out with these cases, some of the steps that we take on there. Sorry about that.
So procurement fraud. Again, that's another sort of major type of investigation that we do. So basically here, and again, we talked about bribery and kickbacks. So in this case, a project manager for the cleanup company, he orchestrated a big kickback and bid rigging scheme to 2 Superfund sites. So the Superfund, I'm sure you're all aware, EPA gives a lot of money to clean up those Superfund, those brown sites. So there's a lot of collusion between those sort of recipients and other contractors. So again, here we have the inadequate internal controls, the related vendors, the connected vendors, and then the subcontracting, which is a big problem. So you'll have your change orders, a lot of issues that come up with subcontractors. The project manager, the fund provided the conspirators with bid prices of their competitors. So basically, they were sort of colluding so that these contractors would get the bid. And then this investigation resulted in criminal fines, restitution, and other administrative actions. Next slide. Program integrity. Energy Star. So this is actually one I'm very familiar with. I've worked a couple cases involving with the Energy Star. Basically, these programs are designed to sort of entice home builders into building energy efficient homes. And they're able to advertise that to their potential buyers that, hey, this is an energy efficient home, and it's going to cut down on your carbon footprint. And they also can sell these homes for a higher amount. A lot of times you're seeing corners cut, other issues where the final product doesn't meet those Energy Star residential guidelines. So then the buyer comes in and they're like, wait a second, my house is taking 5 days to cool down to 70 degrees. We're seeing a lot of that, especially in sort of the Sunbelt states where there's a lot of building going on. So again, in this case, which I'm actually familiar with, the energy rating company who certified the homes falsely certified 800 homes that they were they're rated. So lab certification programs. I've worked with a couple tribes where some of the grant money is designed to help study the drinking water and other issues which would bring in laboratories. So we also investigate these laboratories, especially if they're falsely certifying results. So there was a big case back east recently where the lab was fraudulently certifying results. And obviously this is a huge deal because we take the certifications from the lab. I mean, we take that as sort of the final word. So if they're coming back and they're erroneous, that can create a whole host of problems, especially when it concerns drinking water or soil contamination or anything like that. Next slide. I see Carolyn has a question. Are the prosecuted companies individually placed on a list to ban them from future federal funding? So there is a process called debarment. And if something's particularly egregious, you can have debarment, and that usually involves with grants and also contractors. So that can be, Chris could probably speak more to this, but you can have debarments that range from 1 to 3 years to permanently, I believe. So grant fraud. Again, this is something that definitely, I've had cases involving tribes where a lot of times the tribe will be a victim of grant fraud. They'll hire an outsider who will manage the grant and then siphon off funds. We see it all the time. Again, that's why it's so important to set up an apparatus with internal controls that will help mitigate any of these issues in terms of grant fraud. So here we had a finance director for a tribal grant embezzle the grant funds. Again, happens all the time. again, lack of controls and separation of duties. So again, any of us who have accounting and financial backgrounds, you know, the internal controls, especially when you're handling funds, is extremely important. For example, the person that requests, who issues the checks, they're not the ones that request the checks. That's separate. So if I have a department, you know, I want $50,000. If I was the one that was in charge of issuing the checks, I would be like, okay, you know, of course I want $50,000. Of course I'm going to do that. So you want to have separate controls. So the requester, the issuer, the auditor, that's all needs to be different people. A lot of times people are not trying to be overtly fraudulent, but they're trying to cut corners, save costs. I understand that. So, you know, they'll sort of make a position that's sort of a jack of all trades, but that's one of the fraud indicators, and that can lead to an organization being susceptible to fraud. So here the individual, he misapplied over $310,000 in EPA grant money, and he ended up with 18 months of imprisonment and $40,000 restitution to the IRS, and then $121,000 in restitution to the tribal council. Next slide. So we got another grant fraud. Again, same sort of process, executive director and accountant, lack of control, separation of duty. I'll harp on this, but internal controls are huge. You shouldn't have somebody that's able to, again, request, issue. There needs to be sort of a two-step verification for any types of expenditures, and it needs to be audited. And here, the same thing. Put them in personal accounts to use our local casino. So very typical, very widespread. They were caught, 37 months of imprisonment, and then $570,000 in restitution, and debarment from government contracts for 10 years. So there's an example of a debarment. So they are unable to get any federal money for 10 years. Next slide. Okay, so this probably won't concern you guys at all, but here we have the Buy American Act. So this was part of, after the 2008 financial crisis, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So a lot of the contracts had a stipulation where you had to buy American, and a lot of times, and this happens a lot with the contracting, contractors are trying to save costs. So they'll, and you see this a lot in the procurement fraud, where you'll do product swaps and other issues. So for example, there was a big case, not EPA, but involved, you know, the space shuttle. When the contractor who was designing the space shuttle, they were supposed to use this specific material on the space shuttle, and then they swapped it out for a cheaper material, and the space shuttle ended up, you know, blowing up. That's a big example of sort of the procurement fraud by American Act. Denise, yes. So so a lot of these cases, the tribe is the victim. So they're hiring, again, outside consultants, outside members, and then and here this you're right, there are internal controls in this example that you were giving to me, but they're not being implemented. If the people are not doing their job, then the internal controls don't work. So if the director is not going to take his position seriously, then then the whole system of internal controls would crash. All right, next slide. All right, so this one's a little different. So a lot of times, contractors, especially if they're dealing with something that's sensitive, you have to have a government clearance. So, for example, we all have top secret security clearances. That allows us to see certain material, to work on certain cases. But a lot of times, to get a contract, the contractors themselves, even though they work for a private company, will require a security clearance. So in this situation, the contractor lied and said their employee had a toxic occurrence when they didn't. And what this draws to is false claims, which, although this situation doesn't really touch on tribal issues, the false claims, 18 USC 1001, which is lying to a federal agent, or you'll see that that code on a lot of different documents. So when you make a false statement, that's material. That is a federal crime. It is a felony, and that's something we see a lot. So lying to federal agents, lying on the application for the grant. These are investigations. These are sort of our bread and butter. Next slide. SBIR fraud. So I've been working a couple of these cases. So that's the Small Business Innovation Research Fraud. So basically the SBIR program is, small business comes up with an idea, the federal government will fund it. So a lot of these scientists, professors, they have these research ideas, and then they apply for an SBIR grant, and then they receive the funds. But instead of actually doing the research, they pay their employees 90% of the funds, and they don't produce anything. Or you're having foreign influence that's involved. I don't know how involved you all will be with SBIR grants. But it is a huge sort of priority for us right now is SBIR fraud. Next slide. All right, so lab fraud, we already kind of talked about this. This is where the laboratory actually falsifies the laboratory tests. And in this case, it was for drinking water and wastewater analysis. This could affect you all in your capacity as sort of tribal executives, tribal leaders. And again, internal controls. So the management wasn't adhering to the internal controls. So basically what happened was they fabricated documentation to support the analysis that never actually happened. So this is a huge issue. Again, if you're relying on the laboratory to tell you that your water is good and it's not, that can lead to some major issues. Next slide. Again, here's another laboratory fraud where they didn't actually calibrate the system, and the samples were impacted by some organics, and all the laboratory results were null and void. Next slide. So mitigation of fraud risks. So some of the ways we mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse, obviously site visits. A lot of times on, like, for example, an SBIR fraud case, one of the first investigative steps I'll do, if you're saying your business is doing all this laboratory research, well, I'll just go to the place and see if there's laboratory research being done there. That's simple as that. Inspect work, verify that the work is being done, inspect the backup documentation, ask questions, report issues. You can report issues to your grant specialist, or you can contact us. I believe our contact information, and then also the hotline, which Chris alluded to, the hotline. If you do a hotline complaint, it will come directly to one of the agents in the field, depending on where you are. And since you're all in Region 9, it'll come to us. Next slide. Mandatory disclosures. So this is sort of your duty to us. Again, you are all not contractors, but if you do see any indication of fraud, conflict of interest, bribery, or gratuities, and whether that's somebody within your own organization or an EPA employee that you're dealing with, let us know. Again, the hotline complaint or directly contacting one of us will suffice. Next slide. So again, this won't really deal with you, but this is another mandatory disclosure that you have to do full any violations of any type of criminal law involving bribery, fraud, gratuities that could potentially affect the federal award. So that would be, I guess you could say that would apply to you all when you're doing your grant writing. Next slide. So this is a sort of the manner in which you must make your mandatory disclosures. So in writing, and you can do it via email, US mail, or facsimile. I would get with your grant specialist. If you ever need to do a mandatory disclosure, they'll be the ones that will sort of guide you through that process. And then if there's something that they think we need to look into more, then they would contact us. Next slide. And here's that OIG hotline contact information. So I'll leave this up for a little bit. The number's right there, and then there's the email. Everyone takes a picture of that.
All right. So that concludes the presentation that we have. I would like to say thank you all for the comments and questions that you've been providing during this presentation. I hope that we've been able to answer as best as possible. We are here to assist. A lot of times people see that, the OIG shows up and someone's in trouble or something's not right. That's not what we're always looking to do. We want to create a relationship with you. We want that to have an open communication line. So if there is something that's just maybe raising the hair on the back of your arm and you're going, this doesn't seem right, you have points of contact here in Region 9 that are more than happy to field the questions. Like we want you to call. Those phone numbers I provided, have no hesitation. You can call us at any time if you think something's going on or if you just want to run something by us. We'd be more than happy. And if we don't have the answer, we will get you an answer. We'll get you a good point of contact. Other than that, the team, if there's anything else that you guys want to add, I'd like to open up the floor to anybody else that has any questions that they're going to be holding back on. We'll be sticking around, and we really appreciate you all sitting in on our presentation.
I think we have a question in the chat box. Is there a training available to learn more about the subject?
You mean by fraud or something like that? Yes. I mean, there's private companies that do offer fraud training. However, if there's something that you would like us to meet with you and your folks or your team or whatever, to where we could just discuss something in specific, we could always set something like that up. But for learning just about fraud or some of us are certified fraud examiners. That's a whole course that people do take and learn and get certifications in. So there are plenty of third-party vendors that are out there. We can just provide guidance. We can provide these fraud awareness briefings and guidance on what we investigate on a person-to-person basis. If that's something that you would like.
Awesome. Yeah, there's another one. If I want to run something by you, who should I contact? Should I contact the project officer first?
It all depends. You can contact the project officer if you have something that's going on, but there's nothing stopping you from calling one of the agents here if that's something that you want to just.
Awesome. Okay, we're at 9:50. So I guess it depends on presenters. Would you like to answer the last questions or have them contact you after if they would like?
I think there's one more from Gina. How did we all become investigators? We all came from different federal law enforcement agencies before, but to become a special agent, you apply and then they send you to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, where you go through sort of a police academy. And then there's also a lot of other training opportunities after you become an agent. I think Mike, he did some.
Gina, I think I was fated to get into law enforcement. My father was a sergeant with the sheriff's office back home. My sister was a deputy in the next county. 4 uncles were local officers. Cousin was a police officer and a detective in Pennsylvania, and another cousin works for the DEA. So I really didn't have a whole lot of choice of where my career was going to end up.
Being a law enforcement officer or being an agent comes from different paths for everybody. It's never the same. So, but to become one, yeah, it's apply. If it's something that you're interested in, there are certain requirements that are needed for the job, physical, sometimes education. But if it's something you're interested in, look on USA Jobs. It's an 1811 position. It's the job code. All right, I think that's about it for us. If anybody else has any questions, our phone numbers are in the chat. Please give any of us a call anytime. And we'll go ahead and stop here. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Have a nice day.